Okay, welcome to episode 112 of an Evolving Man podcast. Today, I'm excited to be speaking to Dr. David Perl. Dr. Perl originally qualified as a medical practitioner from St. Thomas's Hospital, London in 1984. He then went on to create and develop docleaf, one of the UK's most successful crisis management consultancies. He holds qualifications in leadership coaching and is a qualified psychotherapist and is experienced in hypnotherapy and NLP. Welcome, David.
Thank you, Piers. Great to be here. Good to see you.
Yeah, thank you. I sometimes like to begin the podcast just with where we met, and I think it was Northern Scotland, 2016. So
You've got
about
a better memory than me, but yeah, Forres on a
eight.
Mankind weekend.
Yeah. I do
Yeah,
remember.
that's
I think
right.
we were in the main hall, kind of divvying up jobs, and I remember being stood next to you and going, "Ah, that's David."
I don't know if that's a good thing or a bad thing.
It's a good thing because it was like, oh, because I think we were on a team together and we were kind of doing something. I can't remember what moving carpets, possibly something like that.
Yeah, quite likely.
Yeah. So, how I'd love to begin the podcast is for you to share a bit of your journey. How, what's your journey been to get into the work you're now doing?
Oh God, it's long and convoluted. I mean, I always wanted to be a pilot. Love flying, still love flying. That's my number one passion, I suppose. And coming from a Jewish family, I have what I call Jewish mother syndrome. You know, and my parents didn't feel like my son, the pilot, had the same panache as my son, the doctor, or my son, the lawyer. So I think there was a bit of manipulation going on behind the scenes, and I can see now how I was trying to get my parents' approval and went to medical school. I was fortunately bright enough to get in. My heart was never really in it though, on reflection. So did 5 years, qualified, and then got into that rut of house jobs and starting to do my further postgrad education for general practice, but never really happy. I was always felt like I was a square peg in a round hole. And then sort of did general practice for a while and absolutely hated it. And I remember once walking into a supermarket and having a full-blown panic attack. And I knew what was happening from a medical point of view, but that's terrifying. And I just knew that I was desperately unhappy in what I was doing. So left medicine and did repatriation medicine, which combined my love of traveling and flying and a bit of medicine as well, flying around bringing back sick people to the UK for insurance companies. And during that time, I was seeing tour operators getting into deep water in crisis, and they were ill prepared to deal with them. So I eventually set up a company, a consultancy to help predominantly travel companies plan and prepare for mass fatality events. And I grew that over the years and we diversified into trauma psychology. And there was always this yearning, I suppose, with my own trauma that at that time I didn't recognize, predominantly coming from my father's experience in him being an Auschwitz survivor. And I remember going when I eventually went into therapy when in my 40s, saying to my therapist after the second session that my father's a survivor, but that hasn't affected me. And I think that was probably the biggest understatement that I ever made. So, yeah, I'd set the crisis consultancy up, did that for about 15 years. I tend to get bored, that 7 year itch, and always looking for something else to do. And then started to retrain as a psychotherapist, realizing that the crisis consultancy was not going to keep me fulfilled. And when I was in therapy with quite a gifted therapist, I actually enjoyed the way she worked, and I had seen other therapists, and the change never embedded. And yet, the work I was doing with her started to really sink in embed. And she was transpersonally trained, so I went to that college where she trained, and that's where I developed limerence, which we may talk about later on, which for me was a life-changing event and has shaped a lot of the work that I do now with couples therapy with my wife. And originally went to do therapy training just really for personal development, because I knew that weekly psychotherapy was never going to be enough to sort out my own transgenerational trauma and my own trauma, my own lived experience as well. And when I started doing the therapy and we had to see clients, I really enjoyed it. And I finally found at the age of about 45, 50, that I could do something that I enjoyed, that I thought actually I might be able to do reasonably competently as well. And so I then started working as a psychotherapist, started a practice, then also did some leadership coaching training, which was through psychosynthesis, which is another psychospiritual type of therapy. And I now work combining those sort of modalities. Some of the time I work with my wife, we see couples with as a couple together. So that's unique, not a common thing. She's also a trained therapist. And I spend, I suppose, the other half of my time predominantly coaching men and providing therapy for men, which I absolutely love. You know, I do think that many men, we've lost our way. And I've listened to a lot of your stuff and sort of similar views, I think, to what you share. So that's a real potted history of, and there was no, you know, I didn't set out. It just I meandered through life, and it took me a long time to really find my groove, as it were. And yeah, and now loving what I do, feel really privileged. It's a privilege, you know, the work that we do, to have an insight into the real intimate personal details of other people's worlds, and I just cherish that. So yeah, feel very, very gifted. I mean, very lucky, privileged, not gifted. Yeah. So
Mm.
that's the potted history of how I got to be here and meet you on a men's weekend through the Mankind Project, and here we are.
Yeah, wow, thank you. What a fascinating journey. I can resonate. One of my best friends, who I've also interviewed on the podcast, he was trained at Guy's and Tommy's, and my grandmother, possibly my grandfather as well, they met. Well, one trained at St. Thomas's, and I think they also met because she was a nurse, he was a doctor. So some synchronicities there, which I fascinate.
Nice. Yeah,
Yeah,
yeah.
yeah. Thank you. So one of the things, I would love for us to begin with is your story of boarding school, because I think it's quite unique a story, and I just think a lot of my listeners, they have been to boarding school themselves or are married to someone who's been to boarding school. So I'd love for you to share a little bit about your story.
Yeah, and I never really stopped to think about boarding school survivor syndrome until really the work that you did and reading Nick Duffel's book. So I went to a local junior school, and then at the age of 11, my parents wanted me to go to I think it was the only Jewish boarding school in the country, Carmel College. And so at the age of 11, I was packed off. I think that my parents had some warning already that I'm not good when there's that separation. I mean, I'm anxiously attached, or probably anxiously avoidant. And twice before, when I'd been sent away to summer schools, which was boarding for a week, I was so unhappy that they had to come and bring me back home early. And so they sent me to Carmel College, and exactly the same thing happened. I became almost suicidal with despair, and wanted to come home, and they wouldn't. They paid so much money, so there was that pressure, even at the age of 11, for me. Oh my God, they've spent all this money on my education, and yet I'm unhappy and want to go home and desperately missing home. And yet there was this conflict because I never felt close to my mother, so there was a real sort of split in my head. And I remember, I think it was on a Wednesday afternoon, we were let out to the local town of Wallingford, and I'd planned my escape. And I found out the local time trains, and walked into town, and I just left the other boys that I was with. And I remember walking past a bush of berries that I grabbed, poisonous berries, and I thought, well, if anybody stops me, I'm going to eat these, so I get really ill or even maybe kill myself, because that's how desperately sad I was. That never happened. Got the train back to London. Had no money. I think I just jumped. I don't even remember. I don't think I brought a ticket. I can't remember. And phoned my parents at Paddington. They called the police, and somehow, and I don't remember how I got from Paddington back home, whether the police came and picked me up and took me home. But I said to my parents, "That's it. I'm not going back." I was so desperately sad, and so my boarding school experience was very short lived. And in some ways, maybe escaped some of the abuse because, like many of these boarding schools, I think one or maybe even more of the teachers were prosecuted for paedophilia. So, there but for the grace of God go I. But it was, even for a week, it was still a traumatic event.
Mm.
And then really sort of, I suppose, empathize with boys that get sent away to boarding school. And I was 11, but how boys deal with it at 6 or 7, or I, I, I just don't know. And I don't know. My view on parenting has changed so much with the therapy that I've done on myself and that I do. And I just don't understand how parents can send their children away at such a young, tender age and put them in the hands of people that they don't know. Just yeah. So that's my story, my boarding school story. Yeah.
Thank you. Thank you. Yeah, it's interesting. Suzanne Zedijk, who we mentioned before we began recording, you know, when we interviewed her for the film, she says it's so important for us to hear people's stories. And I think hearing your stories and then reading other people's, and I've just in this last week been reading the account of Will Carling, the England rugby captain, and also Clive Woodward, the England manager, both boarded. Clive Woodward said that he calls it his boarding school time the dark years, and his words were, "God, I hated it there." And then Will Carlin talks, he went age 6, lying at the bottom of the bed, curled up, just crying because he didn't want anybody to hear him crying. And it's just heartbreaking.
Yeah.
And I
Yeah.
really can't hear, very few stories do I hear where someone doesn't say, "Oh my God, yeah, it was horrific."
Yeah. But I have a cousin who went also to Carmel College, and I'm close to him about a year later, and he was at Dulwich College before, but he had good experiences.
Mm.
But his constitution, I think, is very, very different. And maybe some kids are, I don't know me, but I was going to say more robust. But at that young age, how robust can a child be?
Mm.
Um, and how those experiences, I think, at any age, just being sent away from the primary caregiver, our mothers, um, can't be healthy for us when our brains are developing and evolving at such a pace. So yeah, I would certainly be up there anti-boarding school.
Yeah, yeah, thank you. Thank you. Yeah, so one of the areas I'd love for us to talk about today is a bit about intergenerational trauma. This idea that, you know, if our parents or our grandparents or our great grandparents have been through something, how does that affect us as a child, as someone in that family? So I'd love you to talk about intergenerational trauma. What is it to begin with?
Yeah, so I think that there's in psychotherapy we say that we carry the trauma of 7 generations, and other people say it goes back even further. I was reading about with slavery and with those populations, maybe even 14 generations. But the theory is that if we don't metabolize, we don't process, we don't resolve and do the necessary grief work with our own trauma, it will leach out unconsciously to the next generation. And so even though, if you spoke to my dad, who's still alive, he can't understand why his experience that he went through would have impacted me or my 3 sisters. And yet we all struggle with mental health issues. And I think that we just absorb it. We're, like I said, young children are like sponges. And so if a parent is not present emotionally or is some way responding in a way from their own trauma in a hypervigilant state, the children are going to pick that up. And so I'm absolutely a believer in them. And I see this more and more in my own practice, where I have some clients who actually their own experience, their lived experience is not too bad. They haven't had overt abuse. There might be that emotional benign neglect that we sometimes talk about, where parents are just neglectful, but it's not overt abuse. And we, maybe we just don't know enough about whether that's enough, or but certainly where in their lineage there's been significant trauma. There's been a parent perhaps who's been orphaned or adopted. And I'm starting to think that that in itself, even though they themselves might have had a good enough parenting, that they still absorb that trauma from a parent or a grandparent, certainly if it's a parent. And, with my own experience, I had a mother that was, I describe as a rageaholic. She was quite angry and at times aggressive. And my father just was very passive. But he functioned. He built a business. So the outside world, my childhood wasn't too bad. I still went to public school, private school, once I left Carmel College, but it was a day school. There were boarders there. And I had a good education, and I never wanted for anything materialistically, and I was at home, but there was this conflict between me and my mother. But I do believe that, I struggle a lot with my own, I just mentioned before about being neurodiverse. And when I was doing my therapy training, I came up with a whole list of different conditions, that complex PTSD, codependency, avoidant personality disorder. I came up with about 20 different things. And a lot of those things, I think, well, is that from what I went through, or is it because my father, I mean, he was 11 when he went into Auschwitz.
Wow.
Seven of his brothers and sisters and his parents were murdered in the gas chambers or the work battalions. He then went on to the death marches, where how he survived, I don't know. People just survived. I think it just was just pure luck. Um, and then he was liberated from Dachau, and I realized that so much of that trauma was in me. And I went with him to Auschwitz about 10 years ago. And whenever I was telling anybody about, I'm going back. So even now, I would say to them, I'm going back to Auschwitz with my father. I'd never been there. So why would I say I'm going back? I was going there for the first time. He was going back because he'd obviously been there for a while. And yet it felt natural for me to say, I'm going back there. And when I went there, it was as if, parts of it felt familiar, almost in my DNA. It was the weirdest experience. And I think we do know that the DNA can change through trauma. So I think the research, and there's been quite significant research on children of Holocaust survivors and other trauma survivors, about how our DNA does get changed, and sort of by those experiences. So I'm a big believer that that trauma that our parents went through, we carry. And times are different. My father, when he came to the UK after the war, there wasn't therapy. There wasn't, it was just put up, shut up, get on with it, rebuild your life, get married, have children to make up for the lost siblings that were murdered. And he still now even finds it really difficult, can't talk about this stuff, thinks that what I do is a bit of a cult, and very anti-therapy, because to him it's a step too far to go into that trauma that he went through. And I get that. I mean, I can understand why he would never want to unpack the horrors that he would have gone through, you know just and I've read and listened to a lot about the Holocaust, and not just the Holocaust, other atrocities that as humans we perpetrate on other people. I was in Cambodia a few years ago, the killing fields there, and it saddens me that we just don't learn. We do not learn how to live and just accept people for who they are, and just be tolerant of other people's views, and just accept other people are different. And the world seems to be getting more divisive. Um, and the work that you're doing on your documentary, it sums it up, how traumatized our leaders are, and how much how lack of awareness there is around this.
Mhm.
So yeah, so transgenerational trauma, and I in my training was never really talked about. I don't think it's recognized enough. Maybe with time it will be more so. I
Mm.
don't know I'd like to, what's your experience of it?
Well, yeah, and as you're speaking, it's fascinating, to hear your father's experience. It's like, oh, wow, heartbreaking. And I've I've read a few books, trying to think, Man's Search for Meaning, Viktor Frankl's experiences, which are again,
Yeah.
heart. I guess a question which comes to me is, it's almost the question is that it's around boarding school, is that so many parents go through these schools, they then send their children there, and then when later on the children ask their parents, was what were your experiences of boarding school like? They say it was horrific. Oh, I was sexually abused, I was beaten. Love you to talk to that a little bit, that why is it that we go through as adults these horrific experiences, but then say that, well, so my father went to boarding school himself, you know, and then I was sent, and my grandfather, so many of my family went. It was the done thing. So I'd love you to talk a little bit. Why do our parents do that?
And maybe it's just, as you say, it's the dumb thing. It's peer pressure. It's I don't want to be seen to not be following what my ancestors did. I don't want to drop the ball. Um, I don't know. I don't understand it. As you say, certainly if somebody's been sexually abused, why would they want to put their children back into that environment where to repeat that? I mean, Freud talks about the repetition compulsion, and maybe there's something unconsciously playing out with the parents where, Freud's view was that we'll keep repeating these patterns, hoping unconsciously that we're going to get a different outcome. So maybe if they put their own children into a similar environment, and maybe they'll go through an experience but have a different outcome to the one that they had. So maybe there's something there, but I don't understand it. It's just perhaps lack of critical thinking, or not parents not realizing that they do have an ability to make a different choice to what maybe their generations of ancestors have done before them.
Mm, mm, mm. Yeah. Do you almost feel that it's because by them bucking the trend, it means they'll suddenly have to look at the unexplored life? And suddenly it's like, well, actually, there's a lot of grief there. Or by keeping on with the Joneses, it's like, I don't have to look at this.
Yeah. I think that's a really good point, and there may be a bit of that as well. That the ego is so fearful of looking at itself,
Mm,
and the parents will even put their children back into a similar environment to avoid themselves having to hold up that mirror of introspection,
mm.
possibly.
Yeah, yeah,
Yeah.
yeah. Well, yeah, I've heard a few stories of people who sent their children to my school and their children won't talk to them anymore.
Wow. Because their parents sent them to that.
To boarding school, yeah, to
Yeah.
way.
Yeah, and that's really sad. Yeah, it happens, parental alienation.
Mm, mm,
Um, yeah.
yeah, sad. So I'd love for us to segue a bit into now into limerence.
Yeah.
I'd love what is it to begin with, and then yeah, how does that play out in relationships? Because well, I'll let you describe it. So what is it?
So I describe it as love addiction on steroids. Limerence is when you develop an addictive, obsessive infatuation to another person. And it might be somebody that you just met, which was in my case, I just met this girl a week before and had no more than two conversations for 20 minutes. And I was completely hijacked. It was like a mind virus, or sometimes it's somebody that you've known for a while, that you've been friends with, and then just something switches or flicks, and then that romantic attraction ramps up to just disproportionate levels. And There's a number of symptoms where we are constantly rehearsing what we're going to say to the person. We're hyper vigilant around them, wanting to make a good impression. We're reading into their body language, everything, every word they say. We're trying to analyze to see whether, and it's all about, do they like us? I think so much of limerence comes from, as with all love addiction, a lack of self-esteem at our core, not feeling good enough about ourselves and wanting to get that external validation from another human being. Um, I do believe that most affairs have an element of limerence to them. And many people think that they've met their soulmate, and this is I think there's two schools of thought. You have the twin flame theory, which I don't buy into, or the soulmate theory, where you've met your twin flame, your soulmate, and this person's going to make you feel complete. Or you take more the view, which I call wound mates, where it's some past trauma that is resonating with this other person. And there's a whole host of other factors at play here around attraction, around reproduction, around evolutionary psychology that plays into it. But for me, it was the most discombobulating, painful experience to be addicted. It's bad enough to be addicted to drugs or alcohol or anything else that we get addicted to. But to be addicted, and I do believe it's an addiction, to another human being is incredibly painful. And I told my wife, and she supported me through this. And it took me, well, it was throughout the training that I would see this woman once a week. Nothing ever happened beyond, although I did disclose, and in hindsight, that wasn't the right thing to do because this was nothing about her. With limerence, we say it's not about the limerent object, and it's a lot to do with objectification of the other person because we don't see them as a human being. We see them as an object. We put them on a pedestal. We build them up into this fantasy object of this Madonna or this Greek god, and that's not real. We don't see the real person. And in affairs, this is what happens. People really, and I probably a lot of my work now, maybe half of my work is around limerence. People having affairs in limerence, and every single time, Piers, they can't hear that this is just an evolutionary fluke to get you to go off, leave your family, go and connect with another person, procreate, have some more babies, because that's the only reason we're really here, to keep the species going. And you're still going to take yourself with you. And you're still going to take all your unresolved trauma, all your projections onto that new person and give it time, 6 months to 3 years typically, you'll be back to square one because you haven't looked at what's going on, albeit a lot of it is unconscious, in yourself. And whenever we are looking to somebody else to make us feel whole and complete, that's problematic. It's that external locus of control versus an internal locus of control. And we are putting so much pressure and expectation on that other human being to make us feel better about ourselves. And that can never work. So that's limerence in a nutshell. It's I wouldn't wish it on my worst enemy. It really does destroy lives. I think people commit suicide through it. And But yet for me, it was the biggest, I think, motivator for growth in in my marriage, and also just in me personally to really dive into relationships, not just romantic relationships with my wife, but relationships with everybody, because we're all in relationship. You and I are in relationship here, and just got me fascinated into that whole thing about how we relate and what's it all about. I still don't have a lot of answers, and I don't think we know. I think we're just scratching the surface when it comes to romantic love and attraction. Um,
Mm.
and we're very, I think, very lacking, certainly in the English language, with the words that we use for love. The Greeks have about 6 or 7 different words for different types of love, and we in the English language just it's all sort of bundled up together, and just this romantic love is so different to the love I have for my children, or to my to my brother peers, or to whoever else it might be. And yeah, so that's limerence in a nutshell.
Really interesting. And I can resonate when you spoke about it a few weeks ago when we spoke. I was thinking, I've struggled with limerence most of my life. I'm aware of it now, and yet I can almost put it down to probably the first few months at boarding school, that beginning of transferring my heart onto someone else, a girl. And like you said about making them into a Greek goddess, it's like that's what I was doing. It was like I couldn't talk to them because
Yeah,
they were these deities. So it wasn't until I was 17 that I spoke really to girls very much, a little bit. It was a mixed school, but I would fantasize, I would project, they were in my thoughts all the time. And I see that that carried on, through
yeah,
pornography, it's like that deification, that objectification. And Nick Duffel
yeah,
in Wounded Leaders says, you know, one of the things that comes out of boarding schools is we turn people into objects because of that rational way. We're not connected with the other side of the brain,
yeah,
and
yeah,
everything becomes an object. You're a collateral rather than a person, human.
yeah,
And so I can really resonate with that. And yeah, it feels sad. And I see many men and women who have this.
yeah. And I think it's little known in the therapeutic community. I mean, the word is getting more known, but when I got this, which was 2010, so a while ago, I was Googling for months and then suddenly came across this word and I thought, oh my God, this is what I've got, and there was a forum that helped people that was run by an Australian guy and communicating with other people on there. And I remember going to my wife and saying, "Oh my God, I've got a name for what I've been struggling with." And for her, it was incredibly hard because it was another woman that I was
Mm.
infatuated with, and there was a part of me that would have quite happily run off into the sunset if this other woman had been compliant or complicit in my grand plan. Fortunately, she wasn't. And I remember saying to my wife once that, look, if I was addicted to cocaine or alcohol, what would you do? And she said, well, I'd support you, I'd help you. And I said, well, can you not do the same? I said, no, it's really difficult, but can you not sort of take the same viewpoint of this? But yeah, it's as you say. So yeah, the point I was trying to make is I went to my own therapist because I was in therapy at the time. I had to be because I was training as a psychotherapist, and she said, oh, it's just a crush. I said, no, it's not a crush. I mean, I've had crushes, like attractions to other women throughout my life, even though I was married, and I just never thought anything of them. They never got in the way of my functioning. And yet, when I got this, it was literally from the moment I woke up to the moment I went to sleep, this woman was on my mind. It was, I would say, 95% of the time. And um, it's so disconcerting. And I think gradually with time, my therapist started to appreciate that this was something more than just a crush, because week after week I would go in with my yearning and fantasies of my my thought stream.
Mm.
And I think that the more we understand this, but it all links, I think, to childhood trauma. And I do believe, I can't remember who said it, that his view was all affairs start in childhood. And
Mm.
I think, as I said before, a lot of affairs do involve this limerence energy. And I do think that limerence, I've yet to work with a client, I've yet to work with an addict who hasn't had some significant, sort of childhood trauma, and not big T trauma, just that small, complex, small T trauma. The drip, drip of just not getting enough love as a child.
Mm. Mm.
And how can a boy that's sent off, or girl, sent off to boarding school, how can they get enough love at such a tender age? I mean, how old were you when you
I
when you
went when
first went?
I was 11.
Yeah, So,
Right.
that's puberty. We start going through puberty and developing feelings for the opposite or the same sex, depending on how we're wired.
Yeah, yeah, yeah. I think, yeah, I can resonate so much. The childhood trauma. I think it's almost like, I look at it sometimes on an archetypal level, the king, warrior, magician, lover, or queen, warrior, magician, lover. It's like the lover side, it was like it was no longer there, or I had to squash it. And therefore, if you squash, you've got to put it somewhere. So I was putting it on to the girls. And it was like, save me, be mummy, because mummy was no longer there. I didn't realize
Yeah,
that, you know.
yeah.
Um, and yeah, I think there was quite a lot of shame, I think, involved in that, especially when you're in relationship and then you're having these thoughts and these fantasies and realizing, well, they're not real. Yeah. So what have you found that's really helped with limerence when you've worked with people? What's something that helps to heal that?
Well, you just mentioned it, and that is the shame. Um, People feel huge shame around developing an attraction for another human being. And I work with them to try and get to see that, look, this is just part of the beauty of being a human being. And there's absolutely nothing wrong in developing fondness, attraction, love, whatever the feelings are. It's this thoughts and feelings that go on in our head, and then the behavioral output. The problem becomes when we start having outputs with the behavior where we want to leave our established family or and pursue that, because that's not necessarily the best course of action. So I think it's demystifying it. As I'm sure you're aware, the way to deal with shame is shine light on it. And that was why I was really vocal. From day one, I talked about this at my college. And it was incredibly difficult because the person I was limerent over was on the same training course. So it was really difficult for me. But I thought I'm not gonna go inwards and suppress these feelings. We were encouraged to be honest with how we feel. And so there I was being honest, and yet the college itself didn't know how to deal with this. Even though many people, even in my year and previous years, had affairs, marriages ended, and people had started affairs with other people on the course. It's very common, and they give you a health warning when you start psychotherapy training or counseling training. Your marriage might not survive it. But let's get it out there. Let's talk about it. There is no shame in falling in what love or lust, whatever you want to call it. And I don't have a problem with that. My wife knows that even now, after all these years, I still hold a place in my heart because this woman was life-changing for me. Um, I set a forum up to help people with limerence. I know that two people met through that forum, got married, and had two babies, two children. So, through my experience, there's two more people in the world that would never have been made. So, that's just beautiful. That's amazing. So, I think, yeah, to go back to the question, how do I help? I think it's working on the shame that a lot of people feel. And also, I think with so much of this stuff, it is going back to the childhood wounds and the grief work. I do believe that we have to grieve what maybe our parents, if it's transgenerational, couldn't work through, or if it's our own trauma. We have to grieve for the inner child, the lost opportunities, or whatever, what happened to that child within us. And that work's painful, I'm sure the anger, the sadness, and it's heart-wrenching at times. And nobody would voluntarily want to do that work if they didn't have to, because it's so damn painful.
Mm,
So I think that's also helping a client get to a place where they can do that sort of work. And it's one of the reasons why I'm a big believer in group work and in the mankind. And I'm sure there's other equivalents to that, because there's something in a bigger container that I experience and see myself. Whereas a therapist, it's just a small container with me creating that container, or if I'm working with my wife, two of us. But on a men's weekend, an experiential weekend where we're getting out of our heads into our body, into some emotional feeling, you have a big container, 50, 60 men, staff men, creating that container. Matt, I've seen, and I'm sure Rod, Rod Bootheroyd, who I know will concur that sometimes magic happens in that container that doesn't happen in one-to-one therapy.
Mm.
So, where men can sink to a place, a much deeper place that they couldn't normally do.
Mm.
So,
Beautiful.
yeah, grief work, shame. Um, I think that's the work. And
Mm.
talk therapy, one of my frustrations is it's slow,
Yeah. Yeah.
and I'm impatient.
Yeah. Yeah. Me too. I like to bring a lot of unconscious practices into my one-to-one work with people, just to drop them into their bodies to become more somatic or, you know, going into the unconscious patterns. And I find that's really helped me over the years, working with a Jungian analyst in my 20s, doing a lot of dream work. And that was transformational. I couldn't cry, it's very dissociated. And that's why one of the things I was thinking about limerence. Do you feel there's a connection between dissociation, if we've learned to dissociate a part of ourselves, split off, that then gets put on to a person? It's like, I need that
Yeah.
person because it's me. It's that part that I've disowned.
Yeah, so I think that's another part of it, and Jung describes it as meeting the contrasexual aspects of ourselves. So we meet the anima, the
Mm.
idealized anima in that other person, but it's pure, yeah, it's pure projection. We're just seeing what's in us, but we've split off. It's unconscious,
Mm.
and we need to introject that part or take it back into ourselves. And I was aware of that in my own therapy around the golden qualities of this woman and what was all those things I was projecting onto her were in me, but I had disowned them. So yeah, absolutely, I think that is part of the journey as well.
Mm.
um yeah, I like Jungian psych. I've never been in therapy with a Jungian therapist, but I like the way, from what I've read.
They're
uh,
fantastic. I love
yeah.
Jungian. It was, yeah, it changed my life. I was trying to commit suicide at the time, self-harming, very dark space. I'd lost a couple of stone in weight, about 9 stone, and I started to work with her, and I'd done therapeutic work, counseling, psychosynthesis, psychotherapy, and nobody could get through my wounding. And she asked me to start writing my dreams down, and I would send them to her. I mean, it was intense. I had to wake up 2 3 times a night to write my dreams down, then mail them to her. You know, I'm up to dream number 1310, I think, at the moment, so I'm still going with it.
That's amazing. But
Yeah.
it sounds you started your therapeutic journey much younger than me. It wasn't till I was in my late 30s that I had the courage. In hindsight, I was too scared. It's what we were saying before about parents sending their kids to private school. So it's a way of avoiding looking at themselves. There was a part of me that was so fearful. But so how old were you when you started your journey?
Well, I was lucky because I just totally fell apart. So I was 26, I think. Yeah, it was 2000. I fell apart. I was essentially homeless for a period of time. Went to Africa, tried to help other people, realized it wasn't other people that needed help, it was me. And I went to a monastery for 10 days and ended up staying 3.5 years. One of the supporters of the monastery was a Jungian analyst, and she offered free of charge to work with me, but it meant that I had to make a trip from the monastery to another city, which was a 7 hour return journey every every week to do 3 or 4 hours of therapy and then
Wow.
doing the dream work. And I was a monastic, so we were getting up at 4:45 every day, 2 meals a day. It was celibate. It was intense. I mean, it's a bit insane looking back on it. It's like, what were you doing? But
That's quite a story. There must be a book inside of you somewhere, I think.
I've written one book called How to Survive and Thrive in Challenging Times, about partly about that journey. I've written my boarding school down, but I can't, I've not been able to find a publisher, so it's just sat on my hard drive at the moment.
Right.
Um,
I'll have to look the other one up that you published.
yeah, yeah, yeah. It was wrote it after I came out about 10 years ago. Um, so I'd love for us to segue into relationships. I realize that, as I mentioned, time does go quick. Uh, so I'd love for us to segue a bit into, some of the common problems you see in relationships when you're working with couples. What's present in the zeitgeist at the moment?
I think the most common presenting symptoms in people, sexual difficulties,
Mm,
um, issues around money,
mm,
and issues with a lot of our clients tend to be Asian. I think it's just where we live. Um, Interfering family of origin
mm,
that is very common as well. But underneath that, I think the most common problem is communication difficulties. People not knowing how to communicate using clean, clear, concise language, um, fearful of conflict. In so many, especially men. And I think one of the things many of our mothers did us a disservice by not teaching us how to fight with women. And when I say that, I don't mean physically fight. I mean to really hold our ground and put a healthy boundary down and learn to say, no, I'm not doing that. And so many of the clients that I work with, especially men, I would say they fall into this nice guy syndrome. They want to be liked again because deep down there's this wound that they don't feel good enough about themselves, lack of self-esteem. And so they believe that, well, if I do things to get people to like me, if I'm nice, I'm pleasing, I'm pleasant, I avoid conflict, I don't speak my truth, I'm not authentic. But all that does is create chaos all around them. It's so I think that but communication difficulties, I think, is at the root of a lot of stuff. And also I think a lot of relationships become power struggles where it's almost like again our children come out to play. We if there's conflict, we regress to a younger part of ourselves, and you end up with two people who regress to two little children who are back at school fighting in the sandpit about who's right and who's wrong. And there's a lovely quote by Harville Hendricks, who's a well-known couples counselor, who says, "You can either be right or you can be married." Or yeah, and I really like that, and I think there's so much truth. We say to couples, pick your battles. You argue about so much stuff that is just noise that's just not worth arguing about. And then I think that ultimately the work that we get to is what you touched on before, Piers, about the unconscious. I think that so much of what goes on in relationship is the unconscious projection. And I always remember a comment made by one of my tutors at college who had been married four times. He was 70 and he said he would never marry a therapist. And the fifth time he married a therapist and he worked it out. And he said, suddenly, he said, when we both took back all our projections, the relationship became so easy. We just gave each other space to be themselves. We weren't projecting our own unconscious, unmet needs onto the other person. And I would say that that's with both Ruth and I, my wife had to done a lot of both done a lot of work, and we don't project. Well, of course, there's times where me more than her, I'll project, and I can get onto that drama triangle with her. But we stop projecting onto each other at times because I'm anxiously attached. I'll feel insecure, but I've learned to manage that. She's the avoidance, so we have that classic pairing that's so common. So that's another thing that we look at is attachment style. But so they're all, but ultimately, I think it's trying to help couples realize that until they work on their own stuff, their own projections, it's really difficult to build a really deep, nurturing, loving relationship where we're not putting our demands onto the other person to make us feel better about ourselves. And I think that our supervisor, Roger Evans, who ran the College of Psychosynthesis, where Ruth trained and where we both did our leadership coaching training, said that in his view, the goal of couples therapy is to get the two individuals into individual therapy.
Mhm.
That's the main goal. And I think there's a lot of truth to that. You know, that as couples therapists, we can only help so far. We can help with some tools, we can help with some insights and some interventions, but actually the much deeper necessary work, if we want to have those real deep, nourishing, intimate connections, means that we have to look at ourselves. And I'm going to see, you know, and I agree with Gabor Maté. We were talking about him before as well, that we're all wounded. You know, the norm. You know, the norm. People say, well, that's normal. Yeah, that might be the majority. Doesn't mean to say it's healthy. We're all traumatized, and I don't. Yeah, I think that the textbooks, when they talk about attachment theory, which we haven't really talked about, they say 50% of people are securely attached. I just don't buy that. I think very few people are securely attached. I think most people are either avoidant or anxious or that in between mix between the two. But most of us are traumatized. It's impossible as a human to
Mhm.
have the perfect upbringing where we're not wounded in some way.
Yeah.
And we play that out in our adult relationships everywhere.
Mhm. Mhm. Fascinating. Yeah, I hadn't really thought about the figures. I'm kind of aware of the figures, say, in the boarding school dialogue about compliers, rebels, crushed, get a sense for numbers of those. But with the attachment styles, it's like, yeah, I hadn't really thought of that. I'd always thought quite a lot were securely attached. Um, a lot were some were avoidant, smaller number were disorganized and anxious. But yeah, it's fascinating to think that not many are securely attached.
But if people were securely attached, we wouldn't have a 50% divorce rate in marriages. And the other of those 50% that remain married, from the research shows that probably about 40% are pretty miserable. Now, if people were securely attached, you would have a far higher number of marriages working,
Mm,
and you would have a far higher proportion of people in, well, not just marriage, you know, long-term relationships where people are happy
mm,
and their needs are being met in those marriages, but you know, whether they're emotional, physical, spiritual, um, intellectual. You know, our pies that we were talking about last time, with physical, intellectual, emotional, spiritual, and your R for relationship peers.
appears.
Yeah, um, that those numbers would be much higher. So
Mm,
I don't buy it. Although I do recognize I see a very skewed population, obviously people, but I think even in the outside world, outside of my therapy room, in my judgment, a lot of them are not securely attached.
mm,
Our leaders, I would argue, certainly are not securely attached when I look at how they behave.
100%.
Whatever, yeah, whatever political divide they are, I think they're all. Can I swear or not? I think you'd have to. Yeah, they're all fucked up.
Yeah, I mean, that's obviously the work we're doing with the documentary. I've been doing quite a lot of research the last couple of months, just working out just how many global leaders and global, in all areas, law to, 70%, 70 to 75% of all high court judges in the UK have been to private school. I don't know the division to boarding schools, but certainly quite a lot of them went to Eton, Harrow, Winchester. Um, you know, and these institutions create insecurely attached people, whether that is avoidant, anxious, disorganized. You don't, I think the definition Diane Paul Heller talks about in her book, The Power of Attachment, she says, they were rejected by their caregivers, left alone
Yeah,
too much as children. Well, that's the definition of boarding
yeah,
school. 9 months on your own each
yeah,
year.
yeah,
That's left alone too much, you know.
yeah,
So yes, I really see that our leaders are avoidant, or anxious, but certainly insecurely attached.
yeah.
Um, so yeah, just going back to some of the questions we've put down. Um, I guess the other thing is you mentioned it a little bit about emotional benign neglect when we spoke a few weeks ago. So I'd
Yeah,
love for you to talk a little bit because I spoke to another psychotherapist a few weeks ago, Graham Music, who I believe went to the same boarding school as you, um, who talked a little bit about emotional neglect. So I'd love you to talk a little bit about that. What is that, and how might that show up
yeah,
in adults?
that's a good question. I think most of us, when we think about trauma as children, we're looking for some significant event to that child. And I think in modern society, and this is probably even more so now for the generation coming up, parents are just busy. They're busy trying to survive. They're busy working, busy doing 101 other things, and also they're distracted. You know, how many times do we see parents who are just absorbed into the artificial world of the internet, of social media, and just that rupture with a parent? And I see it. I've got an 18-month-old grandson, and I can see it so clearly with the work that I've done and the knowledge that I've gained, where if I'm sitting on my phone, he'll come over and pull at me and want attention.
Mhm.
And children need that attention. They need that connection. You know, we have mirror neurons. And if a parent is not present, so a parent, you know, we talked about ACE scores before. It doesn't have to be a parent that is physically violent or abusing the child overtly. It just be that the parent is not emotionally present because of their own trauma. So you said before, disassociated. So they're not attuned to the child. The child picks that up. The child knows that there's not a connection, that it's not safe. They don't feel loved and wanted and cherished and nourished and nurtured and all those really important things that I believe we all need as human beings. And so just through that emotional benign neglect, yeah, so it's neglectful. It's not parents on purpose trying to hurt their kids, and I don't think many parents do that. They don't go out to actually mess their kids up, but they're just distracted with the problems of trying to survive in modern day living, even more so now with, well, you know, in the West, I know we're relatively comfortable, and I'm really fortunate. I've traveled to over 100 countries now, and I've seen, you know, how a lot of the countries, you know, in a lot of places in the developing world, there's still a lot of poverty. That those, God knows, for those kids where they're out begging at a young age or going over rubbish tips to find food and things like that, they're all right, their physical needs perhaps are just about being met, but certainly the other emotional and spiritual needs are not being met. How's that impacting them? So I'm mindful that it's easy for me to sit here and be critical of this. You know, and this is I said before about my father. He can't understand why I'm always searching and working on myself, personal development, because to him, I have it all. I had a comfortable upbringing, never had a day where I've gone hungry or cold. You know, I've been very fortunate in that respect compared to the life that he's had, and he can't understand why I'm but it's that emotional neglect that he as a father wasn't able to father me in the way that I needed as a child, and my mother also, because of her own trauma, wasn't able to. So I think it's very subtle, and it's hard to measure.
Mhm.
And in therapy, and this is something that I disagree with, in therapeutic terms, I'm sure you've come across the term good enough parenting. You know, well, that's all a child needs. Children are resilient, and as long as they get good enough parenting. And I believe that that's a term that therapists have come up with to avoid themselves having to look at their own inadequate parenting that they've done on their children. And um, I think that there's no such thing as good enough parenting. Children need more than that. And yeah, it's impossible to raise children without some form of trauma or wounding. But as parents, we could do a whole lot more, a whole lot better. And yet there's no conversation, no dialogue. And I remember um, there's an American. he's no longer practicing psychotherapist, Daniel Mackler, who's got a very active YouTube channel, written some books, and he wrote an article called "A License to Procreate,"
Mhm.
which was, and it's a very controversial article about what we as parents need to be able to comply with before we should be allowed to procreate. And the few people I've discussed it with just are so triggered by it because it does really point out how most of us are just not adequately prepared to be parents. And me too. I've got two daughters, one in their 30s now, and I've had to hold my hands up and hold myself accountable for the wounding that I've put onto them because I didn't know this stuff before I was a parent. And the reality is maybe none of us would get that license because we'd have to do so much work on ourselves to metabolize the trauma of our ancestors and to get into a place in life where we have sufficient money and safety and security and all the other good stuff that children need, that none of us would be of an age where we're old enough to reproduce. So it's pie in the sky. But my frustration is, Piers, that this stuff's never talked about. Look at all the problems we have in this country and the division and that's going on, and yet nobody talks about parenting and the role of parents and the importance of that. These are, huge problems that we don't have the answers to. It's a
Mhm.
lovely book that I read called The Continuum Concept by Jean Lidoff. She was an evolutionary anthropologist, and she spent I think about a year in a tribe, a very primitive tribe. I can't remember whether it was the Amazon or somewhere in the developing world, looking at how tribal cultures raise children and how there's not one mother, that a child can go to any woman in the village and that's their mother. They can get love or a hug if they fall over or something like that, and just how those children grow up sort of far more evolved. And I think, we've lost so much of this from when we left our villages to go into cities in the last few hundred years, and we're developing at a pace with technology where it's getting even worse. That AI, we're just communicating and connecting with machines, not other humans.
Mhm. Yeah. Wow. Yeah, I so agree. I've heard quite a few stories. There's a, a tracker, bushcraft, a teacher called John Young, who spent a lot of time with the San Bush people. And some of the stories he tells of them, it's just beautiful. It's like they've got 25 people, the children, to go and speak to. If I've just seen a worm, and they go and take it. It's like they've got, rather than it just being one person they can speak to, they have the tribe to go and speak to.
Yeah,
And
yeah,
it's just so beautiful that, and one of my friends who I spoke to last night, talking about some research a few years ago, that they found that the community, certainly in the UK 30 years ago, was more together. The most disparate community 30 years ago is the equivalent of the most together community now. It's like we've
wow,
just become,
wow,
we don't speak to our neighbors, we don't really connect to
yeah,
people in comparison with 30 years ago. And yeah, I do see that the importance, like you said, of group work, of
yeah,
being in a tribe.
yeah. Was that saying, isn't it? It takes a village to raise a child, and I think that's very true. And yeah, that I think it was humans. We crave connection. We need it. We can't survive on our own, and yet, yeah, we're living in a more and more isolated world.
Yeah, yeah,
It's
yeah,
interesting times ahead, that's for sure.
yeah. So as we start to wrap up, I'd love for you to share a little bit of your vision as a king, as a sovereign. What do you see? What would you like to see moving forward?
Do you mean holistically from a global perspective, or
Yeah, macro,
or might it?
micro.
Just like I said before, I would love for people to be more to understand. what projection, because this I think ultimately is what it comes down to. If somebody triggers me, it's projection. It's something in me that I need to look at. And if if somebody is different in some way, what is it? Why do I feel threatened by that? And I think this this division, that this, this divisiveness that's going on in the world more and more, until we understand that just because somebody holds a different belief or ideology, it doesn't mean to say that I still can't be in relationship with them in some way. And it's just I think just that ultimately comes down to love rather than hate. That I just wish that we could learn to be more accepting, more accommodating, more loving to each other, and more tolerant of other people's, and that's what makes the world for me so fascinating. It's why I love traveling, is because of the diversity. And I know on the men's work we do in the Mankind Project, that we're big into diversity and inclusion. And I mean, last year I staffed on the GBTQ weekend,
Mhm.
and it was, for me, I sort of identify as bisexual, but certainly for me, just listening to gay men and their struggles with coming out, that acceptance, and it's only through, I think, safe places where we can talk about our beliefs, our views, our judgments, and where do they come from, and how can we start dropping those and letting go of those things, so that we all feel safer in the world.
Mhm.
Because I think that's, as every human being should have that right and privilege to feel safe in the world and just to be accepted. And yet we've got a long, long way to go. As you said, Viktor Frankl's book, Man's Search for Meaning, it's a powerful book, and
Mhm.
yet we're a long way from that still. And look at the Middle East just in the last week, the craziness that's still going on, and I can't see any solution to that.
Mhm.
So that's my vision. Macro, micro, my own little room, my own little world, is just to keep working at being the best father, grandfather, husband, friend. I'm getting, the more I give back, the more I get. So continue on my path with the work I do with the Mankind Project, and on the leadership track there, which I get a lot back from, and just continuing the work that I do with my clients, which feeds my soul. And as I said before, I'm privileged to do. So big, little, trying to make sense of it all. Still trying to get my head around all this existential stuff of why am I here? What's all this about?
Mhm.
And at the same time, not losing perspective that I'm just a little dot in this planet that's spinning around in this much bigger thing, and not to lose sight of that as well, but not to miss the beauty of it all.
Mhm.
So, yeah,
Beautiful vision. Thank you.
that's a nice question. Yeah, I like the question. Thanks for asking it. I didn't expect that.
No, I didn't put it down on the questions, but there we go. Yeah, safety and love. What a beautiful vision. So thank you, Dave.
Yeah,
Well, it's been a
yeah.
real pleasure. How do people find out more about your work?
Well, the limerence, there's a forum, limerence.net, free to use forum.
Yeah.
So limerence.net, they can find and subscribe to there for free. And then with the couples work and my men's work, we work is the marriedtherapists.com. We have a TikTok channel, and which our daughter has nagged us to do, and we do Instagram. Well, I don't do it. We have somebody who does it for us, but so we do some TikToks occasionally. And embarrassingly, on this last weekend that I staffed at the Mankind Project, I had like four men come up to me and said, "Oh, I see you've come up on my TikTok feed. I've been watching you." And we just have small snippets about relationship tips and hints and stuff like that. So people can have a look at that and see us there. But yeah,
Beautiful. Well, I'll put links to the Married Therapists, limerence.net, and to TikTok and LinkedIn into the description. So people, please do reach out to David and watch some of his films or join the at the forum. But thank you. It's been a real pleasure speaking with you today. Thank you so much for your work and all that you do.
Yeah, and likewise, Piers, you're doing really important work as well and bringing attention to what you do. So appreciate that as well. And I've really enjoyed it. As you say, I can't believe an hour and 23 minutes has gone already. Scary.
Yeah, time goes quickly. But,
Yeah.
well, thank you very much. Take care. Bye bye.
Yeah. Bye.